I know we're an international crowd, and my area of expertise really is quite Israel focused. But what I've tried to do is choose certain topics which, for the Israelis amongst us, are definitely relevant. But even for the international folk here, I mean, some of you are maybe secretly planning Aliyah, or even if you're not, you will know someone or have family or colleagues or even children who are here. And there'll be definitely things here which I'm going to talk about, which will be helpful for them as well. Okay, so also in my financial planning and investments, and it's a very wide range of it's a very wide kind of area. And so what I've tried to do is literally, I've thought about the questions I get asked the most, and my most useful advice for people, and I try to put it all into a presentation. And I'll be covering, as I said, a few of the main topics on investment, insurance, and pensions. So, what I normally do is I kind of ask, who here knows what any of the following mean? But you're all on mute, so I'm not going to have a clue what your answer is. But I assume anyway, the answer for most of you is you don't know what any of these things mean, or some of them. And here really is the crux of the issue, because most Israelis will have something of the products or terms, whatever that's on the screen, or even if they don't, there are things which are really useful for people. They don't, but they don't even know what to ask for, what it's called, and it's a shame, basically. So that's why it's as soon as you can, or whenever you can, it's always good to speak to someone and try and find out what's available, what you've got, what you're paying for, what you're not paying for, etc., etc. So that's what we're going to talk about, a few of those things right now. I think I've introduced myself on this forum about 7 times already in the last few months, including about half an hour ago. So I'm not going to introduce myself again, although I will say, in case anyone was happened to be doing something else whilst looking at the camera. I know that no one ever does that on Zoom, but I'm a financial planner. I work with English speakers in Israel on their pensions, their insurance, and their investments. So we're going to start with something very, very basic. And Naomi joined the call, so she's. This wasn't planned. Naomi didn't know I was going to bring this, but basically transferring funds from abroad to Israel, particularly potentially relevant for those of you outside. There are a couple of things here which are important to realize. The first is the procedural thing, which Naomi actually mentioned in her introduction. And I worked for one of the banks for 8 years here, so I was very much involved on a daily basis with all of it. And the first thing is procedural. Okay, moving money anywhere in the world, but in Israel in particular, seems to be quite difficult. Okay, make sure you have all the relevant paperwork. And what I always tell people to do if they know they're getting money in is go to the bank beforehand, tell them what's happening. I'm getting an inheritance, I sold a property, I'm receiving money from a trust, etc. Tell them what it is, let them tell you what paperwork they want, and provide it. Banks hate surprises. What happens just that, from behind the scenes, when you send money into an Israeli bank from overseas, the money goes into kind of a central account, where it sits until the banker or the manager approves that money to go into the account. Now, they'll only approve it if they have the documentation. And if they don't, what happens all the time, I'm sure you've all heard of people who went through this, they just send the money back to the bank where it came from. And that's just, it's just the bank where it came from doesn't look at you again in the same way. There's fees. It's an awkward and it's a pain. So to avoid that, don't surprise the bank. And I think the big one here also is the fees that you pay. And again, having worked in the bank and knowing how much money banks in Israel make on foreign currency, it's really quite alarming. And what I suggest people to do is to use a proper funds transfer company, like, for example, Clear Currency or Currencies Direct. I hope I'm not saying anything wrong there. But basically what they do is they help you avoid most of the fees. Okay, when you send money into an Israeli bank, you pay a large fee on receiving the money. You then tell the bank, okay, convert that money, those dollars, those pounds, convert it to shekel for me, please. The bank will then take another two fees. The first is a kind of a conversion fee, which is can be up to 0.2%. And it also takes a huge margin on the rate. And even if you thought you were clever and negotiated with the bank and got a better rate than they first told you, it's still a terrible rate, much worse than you can get elsewhere. So that's why my first big tip. It can really save you a lot of money using one of these foreign transfer companies. How they work mostly, you, as Naomi said, you send the money to the company's account in dollars, euros, whatever, Australian dollars, whatever it is, and that company places the shekels in your account. You save the fees for receiving the money, you save the conversion fees. You know, people buying property here, that, you know, that's the typical one. Literally, they can save thousands and thousands of shekels, dollars, by doing it this way. So that's number one. Number two, going to a completely different topic, but again, it's something which is asked all the time. Life insurance. Life insurance in Israel all policies are term policies, meaning it ends at a certain age. The oldest is about 80. I mean, you can stop it before if you want, but you can't. Most companies won't allow you to insure your life over the age of 80. Most people don't really want to insure their life over the age of 80. It's prohibitively expensive anyway, but most people tend to get rid of it around 65, 70. The price goes up with age. If you're coming to Israel with making aliyah from the US, I don't know about other countries, but it tends to be cheaper in America than life insurance here is in Israel. So don't cancel your policy. What I will say is that make sure, and again, if you have kids moving here, or if you have friends moving here, you know, tell them to make sure they get a guarantee from their insurance company that they're going to be covered for, you know, all eventualities. You know, if someone gets hit by a bus in the wrong street in Jerusalem, you know, I've heard cases where the insurance company in the state says, oh, that's occupied territory, so we're not covering you, or something like that. So you want to make sure that things like that don't happen. Another bit of advice that I'll give, again, it's another question I get all the time: how much is the right amount of life insurance to take? I mean, Mark probably also has an opinion on this, but you know, there's no black and white. But life insurance is there to basically replace the person's income if they are, you know, no longer bringing in the income. So that, the question really is, for how many years, or for how long, or how much do you want the family not to suffer financially? So if someone's bringing in, for example, 100,000 shekel a year net, okay, you know, the kids are of a certain age, you want to make sure they're, you know, till they turn 18 and they're independent, or if they're Israeli kids, till they turn 25 and they're independent. You want to make sure there's, you know, enough money there that they're not going to, you know, not going to suffer financially, at least. And you do this through the calculation. That's my rule of thumb anyway. The other type of life insurance that exists in Israel, mostly through people's pension plans, is a kind of a monthly income. So, for example, if in most or many types of pension plans, if God forbid the person is working and then they die, then the survivor and potentially young kids will get a percentage of their salary for the rest of their life, which is a nice kind of life insurance to have. There's also a couple of insurance companies which offer a kind of monthly income. So, for example, if someone says, "Oh, I've got, you know, a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old, and if something happens to me tomorrow, I want each one to have, you know, 4,000 shekel a month till they turn 21." You know, you can build the policy that way. Again, the point is just to let you know that these things exist, not to explain how these things work, but be aware that it exists. Okay, we'll finish off insurance on the other important one here, health insurance. Again, it comes up, get asked it all the time. Health insurance in Israel is essentially a group of sub policies. It's not one size fits all policy. Okay, you can pick and choose what you want to suit your budget. I like to kind of group the different sub policies into 3 different categories. One is the kind of the essentials, one is the important, and one is the VIP. Okay, essentials basically are things which you don't have any cover for, pretty much, from the public system, and they also potentially think matters of life or death. You know, if either you have the insurance, if, you know, for example, someone needs a complicated surgery in the States which costs a few $100,000, or someone needs a certain medicine which costs 50,000 shekel a month, which you can't get through the public system. Either you know, pay for it out of your own pocket, which most people can't. You sell an asset. You know, mortgage your house. So this is one of the good tools that I use when I'm, you know, for financial planning, to asset protection. You know, these are important policies to have in place. The important category of things which you can get through the public system, but let's say you want more choice, you want private surgeons, you want to cut waiting times down for, you know, certain things. Those are all included in there. And then there's the VIP things which, you know, are nice to have. But if you don't have them, you know, it's either a matter you're going to pay a few hundred shekel extra, or you're just going to have to wait a bit longer. But, you know, that's the kind of the 3 categories I like to split things into. Price goes up with age as well here in Israel on medical insurance. Also, pre-existing conditions are excluded. So if you come to Israel, or if you join the insurance, you live in Israel and you join the insurance and you have pre-existing medical conditions, those are most likely not going to be counted. Don't get that. That's, by the way, for the private surgery, private insurance. If you come to Israel and join the public system, the public kupot cholim, as they're called, there by law, they do need to accept you with all of your previous medical conditions, which is especially for people making aliyah, midlife, later in life, where there's usually something medical, even if it's not catastrophic. It is nice to know that the public system will cover you for everything. The private insurance will cover you for anything new, which hopefully won't happen. But there is another important one to take into account. The last thing I will say is that most insurance brokers, when they talk to you about health insurance, they will pretty much only talk about these standard, the kind of policies that everyone takes. But you should be aware, and I mean, insurance is a bottomless pit. So I like to I like to ask people, give me a budget that you're willing to invest in the insurance and kind of build it optimally there. There are cheaper versions of some of the sub policies, which you won't always be told about. So again, if you're living in Israel and you have this insurance, or if you know anyone, your kids are coming here, and one of the things you'll tell them is to get themselves private health insurance, be aware that this is something which, these are things which exist. On to investment. The basics. So there's two tracks really. If you want to invest through the banks, there's two ways to do it. The first, and this is a distinction made by law, the first is the advisory track, which is more or less only provided for. I say more or less, you can get some private advisors, but it's through the banks. The banks have investment advisors. You have your money in the bank. They'll do a risk profile questionnaire. They'll make suggestions and they'll tell you what they think or what the bank thinks you should buy and sell. Okay. The advantage of this is that there's no advisory fee. I mean, you'll pay the bank's investment fees, which are not that cheap anyway, but there's no separate advisory fee to pay. The problem is for us English speakers is that there's very few advisors who speak English, and banks, at the best of times, as anyone who's had the displeasure of trying to contact their bank here, they're very hard to reach. So when it comes to investment stuff where you actually might want to talk to someone when something's happening, it's not the best solution always. There are exceptions to the rule, obviously, but that's and again, having been in the system and having been a bank advisor, I kind of I feel like I've experienced it on my skin, as they say. The other option is to have a managed portfolio. So one of the nice things actually about Israel is that if you have a managed portfolio, well, one option is to have the money in your own bank account. Okay, which is you give a third-party manager a limited power of attorney. They manage your money in your bank account, so you retain total control. You'll pay a management fee, but the disadvantage is that there's kind of obviously high minimums for these things. So for people who have amounts that they want to invest, but it's not high enough to reach the threshold, they kind of fall a little bit in between the cracks. Now, there are plenty of solutions here, but in order to kind of keep it a little bit fresh and not just go through it dryly, what I've done is I've brought a few kind of real life examples. The names obviously have been changed for the purpose of confidentiality, but real life examples and situations of people here and their investment needs or situations. And through those examples, I just want to show you again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I want to show you that there are solutions, give you the names of them or whatever, in case anyone or anyone who's interested, and just to show in general how there are good solutions which people don't always know about for various situations. So the first one is Richard, who's just made Aliyah. He's a large investment portfolio outside of Israel, but he wants his portfolio to enjoy the 10-year Aliyah benefit. For those of you who are not familiar, one of the benefits for new Olim is that when the first 10 years after they make Aliyah, any investment or passive income they make on investments that are not in shekel or not in Israeli assets, they don't have to pay any income tax or capital gains tax in Israel. Okay, which is a very nice benefit to have. If you're an American citizen, and Mark, we were speaking about it last time, the benefit is a little bit more limited, although it can still be a benefit because Americans still pay tax in America. But for most other countries, when you leave, you don't have to pay tax in the country you left. You'd only have to pay tax in Israel, but Israel says, hey, take 10 years, don't pay us tax on any investment or passive income that you make. So Richard wants to take advantage of that on the one hand. On the other hand, he made Aliyah from Australia, and he wants to have someone in Israel on the same time zone as him, as someone who he can visit, who can pop around the corner and meet whenever he wants. What can he do? Okay. So the solution for Richard is actually one of the things I mentioned before. The only real solution that I know of for this kind of the 10-year Aliyah tax benefit is through a managed portfolio, which, as I said, is through the bank. Okay, it's managed by a local manager. There are some people who can manage. I keep going back to the US. It's just because US people from America are the most common group of English speakers in Israel. You can manage your money here in Israel. You can manage the money in the US or overseas in certain jurisdictions with a local licensed portfolio manager. As I said before, the money is held through the bank, and you can have someone here, as I said, who can manage the money even if it's overseas, not everywhere, but it's a very good solution for this kind of situation. The only thing to take into account is that in order to qualify for that 10-year break, as I said, you can't invest anything in shekels, obviously. You also can't be clever and buy Israeli companies that are listed on the NASDAQ in dollars, right? Because you'll also, those you will pay tax on in Israel. Also, there are certain bonds, Israeli government bonds or certain corporate bonds that also they're issued in euros and dollars. You won't get the tax break on those, even though they're not in shekel. Okay, solution number one. Number two, I'll do 2 and 3 together because so as to speed it up a little bit. Local Israeli solutions. Dina and John, 3 young kids. They want to set up long-term savings plans. Michael, you can see I've been very creative with all of my names, by the way. Michael made Aliyah 15 years ago. He's 62, works as a lecturer in Tel Aviv University. He's due to retire in 5 years' time. He has some savings both back in South Africa and here in Israel. He's worried about not having a large enough pension to retire on because he made Aliyah, middle of his life. Whatever happened with his home country pension is irrelevant. He's unfamiliar with the options here in Israel. And Dina and John, who I quickly skipped over, they want to save on a regular basis for their kids. They don't want their money sitting in the bank doing nothing. And they also want the flexibility to withdraw the money when they want. So there are a few decent solutions, which are becoming more and more mainstream, I have to say. The last 3 years was this is something called a Kupat Gemel Hashka'a, which the country introduced about 3 years ago. Bottom line, it's basically it's a flexible savings or investment account which every citizen of Israel can invest up to 71,000 actually shekel per year. You choose, you choose a company who you want to manage the money based on performance, service, fee. Or you have an advisor. That's the kind of thing I do with my clients if they want me to make a recommendation. You can choose high risk, low risk, et cetera, et cetera. You can't say, I want you to buy, small cap Japanese stocks, and I don't want you to buy weapons making companies. You don't have that level of flexibility, but you have a generally, diversified, well spread out portfolio. You have tax deferral, meaning you don't pay tax, capital gains tax, until you pull the money out. But if you change your investment strategy without pulling the money out, you go from, let's say, low risk to high risk or vice versa, that doesn't incur any tax. One of the nice things about this is, and this is why it's particularly useful for someone who, let's say, people who make Aliyah and want to boost their pension because they're not going to have enough years on a high salary to get to the pension they want, is that if you keep the money invested until you turn 60 and above, and then you use that money to buy yourself a pension, basically, then you won't pay any tax on any of the growth that's been in that fund all the time. So it's a really, really useful tool for helping to boost retirement. Again, very common. People make Aliyah in their 30s, even 30s, 40s, 50s. So, they have money, have savings on the side. This is a great tool to help them boost their retirement, if their pension, if they want. But again, the money's liquid and available whenever they want. They don't have to use it for the pension. If they do, there's a tax incentive. Okay. Michael, this is actually one of Michael's issues. So he has, again, a Kupat Gemel Hashka'a number 2. There's also something called a Polisa Financied. Again, it's kind of, if you remember, the one before has a 70,000 shekel limit. This one does not have a limit. You have tax roll up. It's liquid. You can take the money out whenever you want. It's a way to manage shekels in a kind of tax efficient, flexible manner. Okay, I won't bore you with any more details on that. But definitely, if you have money, or if your friends or family in Israel has money sitting in the bank doing nothing, and they're nervous to talk about shekels, There's no reason to be. There are good solutions out there. I will say, by the way, these last two things for US citizens are not appropriate necessarily in most cases, but for anyone who's not US, these are good, very good and common things that are used. What about someone who is US? Naomi is a US citizen and wants to be able to do something, anything with her savings. What can she do? Well, what are the issues? The main issue is what's called PFIC, passive foreign investment company. Anything that is defined as a passive foreign investment company by the US potentially has penal tax rates. The US is very mean, and if you have one of these and haven't been reporting it properly, they will tax you very highly. And the problem is that most of the regular investment vehicles fall under the category. So ETFs, Israeli ETFs, or any non-US ETF, sorry, mutual funds, provident funds, all the kind of things we were talking about before, they all have this issue. So it's a real headache for American citizens who have money to invest. Again, those who have from, let's say, 500,000 shekel and above to invest, there already are solutions through the managed portfolios. But people who have less, it's still large enough amounts they don't want sitting in their bank doing nothing. What do? So again, I'm not going to pretend there's some magic solution, perfect solution, but there are certain things that they can do, again, to stop the money sitting in their bank account. Obviously, one thing that's not on the list here is that they can send their money back to the States and invest it through a brokerage account there. But then if you're working here and you're earning shekel and your savings are in shekel, you have the currency risk and you have the costs. So what can you do in Israel if you're a US citizen? Well, deposit interest, for example, if it exists, which it doesn't, but in theory, if and when it exists again, is not a problem for Americans. If you buy individual company securities, so if you buy shares in Bank Leumi and Teva and blah, 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 or you buy bonds, individual bonds, that's also not a problem for a US citizen. US-based funds and ETFs is also not a problem. You can actually buy through your bank or through an Israeli brokerage. You can buy, US-based investments and then hold them through your Israeli account. Loan interest. So there are investments, lending platforms, or various investments which are structured whereby you're not receiving dividends or capital gains, but you're receiving loan interest. No problem for US citizens. And again, certain investments which are structured as partnerships also can work for US citizens. What I always tell people to do is mostly just to take the responsibility off my shoulders, because I'm not a US CPA, although I kind of am quite familiar with it, is make sure your US CPA approves what you're doing before you do. I think we'll pretty much stop there. Just to apart from the fact, again, just in order to help give you a couple, just to throw a few ideas at you so they know they exist. There are plenty of alternative investments in Israel as well. Some work for US, some don't. There are because people are not familiar with shekel or Israeli investments, they tend to think, oh, there's nothing here, and they don't do anything. And chaval, because there are plenty of things here that you can do. If you want to whet the appetite for next time, again, there are other interesting things as well. There's annuities in Israel that people don't know about. There's reverse mortgages, which people are very unfamiliar with. There's algo trading solutions. There's certain tax breaks, etc., etc., etc. Bottom line is, there's plenty of options out here, and a lot of them can be very suitable for specific situations. So make sure you speak to someone who can help you with that. Okay. Thank you for listening, and have a great rest of day, everybody.
Thank you so much, Gadi. That was great.
Thanks, Gadi. That was great.
Does anyone have any questions for Gadi? Or was that okay? Perfect. Gadi covered everything. Great. So what I'll do now is I'll put everyone into breakout rooms again for another 10 minutes. Then we'll come back and look to close. Hold on.